morning, everyone. We are now in the last week of the Easter season, with next week being Pentecost. But the first reading, the one we just read from Acts, takes place after Pentecost. The book of Acts tells the story of Jesus' disciples establishing the very beginnings of the Christian church, traveling around ancient Greece, Asia, and on to Rome to proclaim the good news. During their journey, stories of suffering and imprisonment abound for Peter and later for Paul and their fellow travelers. The gospel reading takes place the other side of the crucifixion, resurrection, and Pentecost, at the very end of the Last Supper, just before Jesus is arrested. It forms part of a trilogy of prayers. In his last hours of freedom, Jesus is aware of what lies before him and takes time to dedicate himself and his followers to God. After asking to be glorified himself, he prays specifically for his disciples and then broadens his prayers out for all those who will come to faith through the actions of his disciples. So, unbeknownst to Jesus, he actually already prays for the jailer, who in the Acts reading becomes to know God through Paul and Silas's action. When I tried to summarize the core content of Jesus' prayer for this reflection, I was drawn to a theme that kept repeating, and it's a theme of being in another person. Jesus prays, "Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us." He continues, "I have given them the glory that you have given me, and that they may be as one, I in them and you in me." And right at the end again, "in order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them." And that's what we've just sung, isn't it? Live in me. Now, I find the concept that we carry people inside of us really intriguing. And as someone who knows a little bit about psychology, I've come to understand just how important the people of our inner worlds are. It's a little bit like the Russian dolls. We're going to have a wee picture here. You know the dolls you get where you have a doll inside and a smaller one and a smaller one. So we all carry people inside our hearts. Now, there are fancy words for that in academic literature, and we don't really need to know them. But what's pretty certain is that the kind of people you carry in our hearts make a difference. So if your inner emotional life is peopled by experiences with others that are loving and supportive, you will have a much higher likelihood of living a thriving life and a positive life than if you carry people inside you that are negative and destructive. And those people stay with you, those inner people stay with you even once the physical person is gone. And they can also get inherited across generations. And what's fascinating to me about that is how much this inner world influences our actions. If we go back to the first reading that the kids have so dramatically shown us, we have a situation here where Paul and Silas have been publicly condemned, they have been physically assaulted, thrown in the part of the prison that was most removed from the outside world, their feet in chains. And yet they were singing hymns to God. They didn't behave like prisoners ought to, not hopeless, not dejected. And then, when the earthquake comes and loosens their shackles, they don't flee. They don't liberate themselves as we would expect a prisoner to do. To all intents and purposes, they didn't behave like prisoners at all, but like free men. Now, When I read the story, I'm inspired and reminded of all those folk who survived injustices and atrocities somehow, retaining an inner freedom, even in the depths of oppression. So I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela, for example, who's going to come up here, or of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, appearing next to him. People who were free, although they were imprisoned, in torture and suffering, because their freedom came from within, came from having Jesus in their hearts. Now, the opposite is, of course, also true. It's those people who oppress and scare us, who can have a toxic influence on us, holding us captive, even though we are physically free. Quite recently, on the BBC, there was a television series called The Responder. If you still got to watch it, do close your eyes. No, your ears, no, not your eyes. Do close your ears, because it's a spoiler warning. One of the characters in the series is locked into a cupboard by their coercive partner with a clothes hanger, just like on the picture here. So you can see. There you go. I put the picture at the wrong place. Sorry, Beverly. The quote at the wrong place. So the clothes hanger was used to keep the cupboard door shut. Eventually, her colleague comes to free her, and when he opens the door, the captive looks into the coat hanger, incredulous, not understanding how something as simple as that could have held her captive, could have been so easily broken. Her colleague looks at her quite calmly then and says a sentence that really struck a chord with me. He says, "It's not the coat hanger that kept you in there. It's not the coat hanger." There you go, coat hanger down the bottom. So you see, freedom is all about relationships we experience with others. And going back to Bonhoeffer, he wrote on freedom quite extensively, having survived concentration camp under the German occupation, under the German Nazi regime when he was in the resistance. He said, freedom is not a quality of man or a capacity. It's not a possession or a presence. Freedom is a relationship and nothing else. Being free means being free for the other, because the other has bound me to him. Only in relationship with the other am I free. And then the crucial question becomes, what kinds of relationship am I engaged in? And the reading in Acts, tells us about at least 3 different kinds of relationships. There is the relationship marked by exploitation, like the slave girl and the slave owners. And one of the encouraging plans offered by the Queen's speech that, just earlier this month was the intention to increase the protection and support for victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. Because modern slavery does exist, and exists right here in the UK, in Glasgow. There are relationships marked by fear, like the jailer who was so afraid of his superiors that he wanted to take his own life. And for many Scottish young men, the fear of the consequences of their actions, for example, gambling away their money, pushed them to want to end it all. And then there's the relationship characterized by love and unity that Jesus prays for. And it's that lets Paul and Silas sing songs, even in prison. And our experiences of relationship set up expectations of how we will be treated. That's why some people get stuck in the same relationship patterns over and over again. And what it takes then are radical examples of people behaving against our expectations to free us from the patterns we have acquired. And that's why I think that next to the miracle of the earthquake appearing and the chains breaking, there was a second miracle in the story. It's a miracle that was there for the jailer, who was so imprisoned by his fear. His miracle was that he got to observe behavior that he could not have anticipated, and that totally contradicted his expectations. He heard singing in the prison cell, he observed that the prisoners didn't flee, but more than that, they clearly saw his desperation, calling to him not to harm himself, reassuring him, we're all here. They who should have loathed him care for him. He is not treated as the oppressive tyrant, but is seen with love as a struggling human being. And at that, his world turns upside down. It's that makes him turn towards Jesus, that makes him believe. And there are plenty of examples in the Bible where God confounds expectations by his readiness to love. Got just 2 examples on the next slide here. We've got the Samaritan. It's Samaritan of all people who tends to the injured traveler. And we've got the woman surrounded by people wanting to stone her to death, who through the Jesus intervention is free to leave and free to live. And in response, the prison warden himself starts behaving like a free man. His acts are no longer described as those fearful of the Roman authorities, but as voluntary actions characterized by love. He feeds Paul and Silas, he tends to their wounds, and above all, he's now experiencing a deep joy. And in a way that completes the circle, the faith of the jailer is in itself an answer to prayer, to Jesus' prayer. When we look at the structure of Jesus' prayer, we see comments on what Jesus has done, things like, I have given them the glory, or I have made you known to them. And we see things he prays for, he hopes for, and he prays for. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me, or then the world will know that you have sent me. So Jesus is praying to God. So Jesus is praying that God is revealed in the world through his legacy, and God posthumously answers his prayer. Yes, your life has helped others find me, and yes, you have lived on in their hearts. And maybe that's where Easter resurrection really lies. Not just in the body, but deep in our hearts. Not just all those years ago on Golgotha, but every time Jesus breaks through our internal prisons and sets us free. Amazing grace indeed. Amen.